Hi everybody. This is an overview recording of a presentation I gave for the Stanton Library for this year's Comic Conversation event here in July. That's in North Sydney. It was basically an introduction to making comics digitally, and we had quite a few people miss the very beginning and had some people ask for review type information. So what I've done is just gone over the slide presentation here briefly. Not as much detail as the original presentation, of course, but at least it's something to refer to. As I mentioned at the presentation, if you have other questions or want more information, feel free to contact me through my website, seaboltillustration.com, and I'll be happy to help you with any questions. So without further ado, let's get on with the presentation. So as stated, the presentation was on making comics digitally, and it's an introductory session. So if you don't have any experience making comics, or if you want to learn how to make comics in a digital manner, or if you don't have a lot of experience with digital art, this is sort of a primer for that kind of thing. The first part of the seminar was about the terminology and structure of comics, so pretty basic stuff. If you're familiar with this, feel free to skip ahead. Basically what I did is go through and describe what comics pages are made out of. They are basically set up in panels, which are these windows here, and each panel represents a moment in time. You can achieve more than one moment per panel, a different setting, that kind of thing. It's a little more tricky to pull off. Generally speaking, when you read a comic, each panel will be one particular moment in time. The space between the panels is generally referred to as the gutter, and that can actually affect how your story is perceived based on the thickness of it, how much different space there is between the panels. For instance, having a wide gutter, a lot more space, can make the time between the panels seem longer. There are all kinds of little tricks like that you can use. Things where dialogue's included will include things like speech balloons or speech bubbles. This is where characters deliver lines. You're familiar with this, I'm sure. This is pretty much comic trope. There are also thought balloons, but those aren't used as much in modern comics anymore in deference to things called captions. Now, these used to be just narration, where you can imagine a narrator of a story telling you what's happening. In this case, suddenly, that kind of thing. But more and more lately, they're used for internal monologue. So instead of a thought balloon, generally speaking, characters will express their inner thoughts in a caption box. Just some general terminology of comics pages. Some more terminology here. We've got an example of a couple of different types of comic pages. When an image takes up the entire page without any panels, it's just one giant panel basically. It's referred to as a splash page usually. It's usually something big and dramatic happening. It may also include some other panels, but generally speaking, if it's one giant image, whatever the form, it's considered a splash page. If it's two of those together, meaning you open the book and both pages fill up one image, it's called a double spread or double page spread, sometimes a double splash, depending. But basically, this is the most impactful thing you can do with your book because this is the most real estate you'll have to work with in the format. 2 pages wide is about as wide as your comic can go. And there are a couple different kinds you see here. One is one giant scene. This is basically one big dramatic moment happening here. These monsters are bursting out of this dimensional portal and the people are freaking out. And then there's another kind where it's one scene, but there's a lot happening in the scene. You still got narrative thread happening all through here. The panels are still being read left to right like traditional English comics. But it's all happening inside this main panel, and literally happening inside. I mean, it's all happening on these 2 pages, but the setting is the main panel, and the action of the scene is the top panels, and then down through the middle panel to the bottom panels. It's very impactful, good way to set up and establish a setting or a big dramatic moment without a lot of wasted time or space. The type of panels in the layout can also help you with your storytelling. Over here on the left, we've got an example from Watchmen where it's a basic 9-panel layout. This is kind of a more antique style now, but I think they were going for something particular with Watchmen with this. All the panels are the same size, the same shape, so it leads to sort of a beat where each panel seems to take the same amount of time, but you manage to get quite a progression through the story because there doesn't seem to be much happening in the panels until you get to this third one where there's some action. A character picks up something. And then by the end of the panel, he's scaling the building. So 1 page, 9 panels is actually quite a bit to fit on a page, but you manage to get a lot of action and storytelling in this one scene. Also, notice that there's no dialogue or caption of any kind. This is what's known as a silent page. And that can be very effective also. Over on the right, we've got a page from Weapon X, which is an X-Men story. The layout of this panel structure is a little different from normal, but pay attention to the size and shape of these panels. Generally, panels that establish setting will be horizontal because we tend to see things in a landscape format. That's why films look more or less better in landscape. but you can also play with that because this long establishing shot, first panel here, is quickly interrupted by a panel of the same size and shape. However, it's an action that's taking place that obviously doesn't take very long. And also use some clever artistic tricks here to highlight what they're talking about. The words experiment X get transformed into X-Men through the lenses of the glasses. Just a little trick of the art there. When it comes to page flow, these two work slightly differently, but not that much differently. We're speaking generally Western-style comics here. Manga and anime run the other way. Anime is not comics. You know what I'm saying. Generally speaking, we read left to right and from top to bottom. So 9-panel format is about as basic as it gets. You go left to right, down to left to right, down to left to right. This format is similar, but it's laid out a little bit differently. You start at the top left again, but then it immediately pulls you down to this bottom panel because they're the same shape and size. You go to the left to find out what happened with the action there, who's lifting the glasses, what are they doing with them. Then it leads to this inset panel, which is the very center of the page. You have a moment of reflection. There's actually a little caption box there with some inner dialogue, like we mentioned before. Then it leads you into this dramatic vertical L-shaped panel where you've got lightning striking a tree. And that visually brings you back down in here and then back out to the edge of the corner panel when you go down again. So the format through this one is straight through to the middle, back to the right, and straight down. It's fairly simple, but it looks more complicated than that. Another way to use those panels for storytelling is to establish what you show in the panel and, again, how large and well-spaced the panels are. The first panel is an establishing shot because of the cinematic format, the horizontal surface here, and also it sets a mood because you've got the character standing in kind of an awkward position. There's some debris here. There's what turns out to be sweat dripping down. You don't know that yet, but you go to the second panel down and you find the same scene, the same shot basically, but the camera is tracking up. Visually, the camera is what you're seeing through the panel. It also seems to take a bit longer because it's showing a little more height. These inset panels are smaller, therefore they seem quicker. They indicate action happening concurrently. You've got the sweat dripping, the character's starting to say something and the sweat's dripping. That's just sort of a balancing thing. Notice how it also plays off the position of the hands in the panel above. And the bottom panel is a longer pace kind of establishing solid shot. The character has resolved something here and is sort of shown from a heroic angle up and is a more solid statue-like pose. These kind of tricks can help you tell your story all in one page. And you're not just set to the standard page format, of course. You can do whatever you want with your comic. Here's an example from Hawkeye. There's a very good silent page panel set that uses no dialogue and non-traditional panel layout to tell a story. This dog is basically just walking along a hallway, sniffing at each door, trying to find his home. They're trying to find something in particular. And what we see at each door is what he senses. Because dogs don't communicate in language, this seems to make a lot more sense to us that a dog would think in these symbols, these pictograms. This is what he's sensing. And we know he's smelling because we have this literal diagram of his internal skull structure and scent going into his nose. So at each door he gets to the end here, he finds the one he's looking for, that gets his attention, and it breaks the continuity of these panels down to this offset. So basically it still reads left to right, but the actions happening above the panel are the same as what's going on in the panel. It's like two layers of meaning. Also notice in the background here, you've got these stairwell. That also guides your eye from top left to bottom right, which is traditional layout. This other set of panels here is a 2-page spread from Amazing Spider-Man issue 33. It's a very famous set of panels. If you've seen Spider-Man Homecoming, you've probably seen this scene recreated in the movie format. Basically, Spider-Man is pinned under a large piece of machinery, and he can't get out. He can't seem to find enough strength to get out, and he's got people depending on him as always. So he struggles, he fights, and eventually he manages to lift the thing out. The important thing to notice about the panels here is the size change and the focus of the change. The first panel is focused on the debris and the fact that water's dripping everything on everything. Second panel, we see the hero kind of dejected. Third panel, he's struggling, he's trying. This panel, which takes up half the page, is sort of a moment of determination. You see a lot more that's going on. You see his definite action lines going up. There's a lot of struggle here, and then the big payoff is the splash page next, where he manages to get the machinery off of him. Here's some more creative ways to do panel layout. In the case of Killing Girl over here, there actually aren't any panel lines at all, so the gutters and the panels are sort of vague. Also notice the color difference here. When you've got an action panel like this, and this is a large establishing shot action panel, everything is just bright yellow and some red sound effects. You've just got a lot of action, a lot of movement. The art is particularly bold and action-oriented here. Second panel, same deal, more compressed because the action is taking place from the vertical direction. Third panel is kind of a pause. The character is done in different colors. The background is still lit up, so there's still tension there, but the character's colors are muted. And then back to action scene here for the last panel. They still work like panels, even though they don't have the borders around them. Here in Daredevil Man Without Fear, you've got what is basically a splash page with panels inset, but because this is all one giant watercolor painting, it doesn't fit traditional structure for comics right away. I mean, it still happens this way. This is basically just a scene where two characters have a dialogue between each other, and the flow goes from the top left to the bottom right, which is standard. But if you don't follow the text, then it doesn't make quite as much sense. It's sort of dreamlike, which for this book is actually very appropriate because they're discussing a boy who has some sort of mental disability. He's got some kind of obsession with fantasy world and superheroes, and the art is reflecting the real world butting up against the imaginary world, and these characters are trying to figure out how to help this kid. So you have technically three different panel sections. You've got the kids. It's like a flashback section here where this is what they're talking about. Then you've got a couple of shots of them, their heads, then interacting, sort of, even though they're not directly interacting to you at the very bottom. It's just the text. And then the bottom, they're interacting in a more literal way, even though they're drawn much more fluidly and loose here. It's the same sort of structure as traditional paneling. It just doesn't look like it. Over here on Justice, we've got a similar layout. I'll put this in just to show you an example of what you can do with traditional panel structure, but still tweak it to be unusual. As you can see, it's pretty traditional stuff. You can just go panel down to left, right, down. Notice how this panel in the middle, this shot here of Aquaman and the monkey jumps on his chest, it breaks the panel lines here for the monkey and here for his head. So you've got, this action seems pretty stiff and normal with the panel borders still existing, even though there is no gutter, until you get to the scene where it's really dramatic, and then everything breaks the borders. So that's a trick you can use as well to heighten tension and to pay off a scare in this case. All right, so now that we've got a little bit of background on what comics are made out of, how do you make yourself a comic? Comics are basically made out of story and art, and for story you'll need some sort of script. If you're working on your own comic, it doesn't have to be very formalized, and the script has to be broken down in terms of pages and panels. For the art, you'll need several iterations of the art for the comic to make it into something that works like a comic. I'm speaking of traditional color comics here. And the process you go through, it's standard process for most things, but if you're doing a painted comic or if you're doing a pencil-only comic or something like that, you might not do all these steps, of course. Your thumbnails will be your rough drawings, which you begin with based on your descriptions of your script. Pencils are more cleaned up versions of that, more clarified versions. You can tell exactly what's happening in each panel. Inks are where you go through and you clarify more with the hard cartoon outlines if that's what you're doing, or just basically a finalization of the structure of the art. And then you have your color, which is done first with flats, which are just basic color shapes to separate objects from each other. And then if you go this far, tones, which add some more shadow and depth to your colors. There are comics that have nothing but pencils. There are comics that go just black and white. Comics would use inks. And also, usually for traditional comic producing, you'll be making your shadows in inks. You'll black them in with solid ink. You don't have to do that, of course. You can do whatever you want. But a lot of people also like to do the color stages when they get a little more creative, and they do sort of painterly shadows, where the shadows are made out of color rather than flat black ink. This is all variable stuff. This is just traditional process. And this process came about because of the assembly line nature of the original comic production system. You'd have someone who did thumbnails and pencils, and then they'd pass it off to someone else who did inks, which you had to do because you couldn't print. Graphite wouldn't reproduce well enough with the machinery they had. Nowadays, you can easily reproduce graphite in a printable format, and it'd be easy to print a comic that's just graphite pictures. And then the colors were limited because, again, the reproduction quality they had to use printing plates for imagine newspaper colors. The flats and tones thing is more of a it's more of a Silver Age on, kind of like 70s, 80s on industry standard, just to make things look a little more interesting and to sort of relate them to animation type stuff. Here's a quick example of a script I have for one of my mini comics called Deadeye. I'm using a program here called Celtics, which is free. It basically it's like a word processing program that's functionality is set up for script writing. You've got your pages laid out here. I've written little brief descriptions of what happens in these 3 pages. You've got, here's the breakdown layers. The page number is up here, so this is the whole page. You've got the panel, how many panels this is. You can write, some people write page and this how many panels. I was freeforming this one at the time, so I didn't know how many panels at the time. So I just wrote the page, wrote a panel, wrote what happens in the panel. Kept doing that until I had the whole page. And then I went through and finalized some dialogue. It's just like any other script. You've got the actor saying the dialogue and the dialogue here. Here are a set of early art for the page we just saw in the script format. These are the thumbnails with panel layout. This is when you're going to pick how large each panel is based on what's happening in the panel or what you want to say with the panel or how that flows together. I find it's always best to look at a page entirely by itself, like together, before you make any big decisions on how large panels should be or where they fall, just to make it easier. Also, this is a good time to spot in where your speech balloons are going to go, because if you're going to have big speech balloons like this, there's no reason to draw what's going to be behind here at all. You won't need it. I mean, you can sketch it out if you need it, just for balance, but you don't need to finish it up at all. In the case of this particular page, I knew I was going to be going through visual effect kind of shot on this one and this one, so I didn't have to go too far in detail on either of those panels. You'll see in the pencils there's even less detail than the thumbnail. So basically pencils are just a tightened up version. Everything's been sized properly. You've got better drawings of the background, that kind of thing, better positioning, that sort of thing. In this story, this is about a gunfighter who's losing his eyesight, so occasionally you'll have these special effects shots where you see through his point of view and he's got like this blurry macular degeneration problem. And that came in really handy for this dramatic shot here, this character silhouetted against the light of the door, when the door is completely blocked out by his vision trouble. This was purely a black and white comic, so this is as far as the art goes on this particular page. For example of a color comic, this is another Last Goblin. So we get up to the ink stage, everything's the same. You'll notice that this little fairy character here, the inks aren't black, they're yellow. This is something you can do easily digitally. You can do it traditionally as well, but it's called ink holds or hold lines. Basically, it just means that I wanted that character to be very bright. I'm doing like a special effect version thing on this. As you can see, this character is going to be a special effect kind of thing, and a light source. So having a big dark line around that wouldn't work very well visually. So I just decided to take those particular ink lines and do them in yellow instead of black. That was the only real difference. These are the flats for that page. Basically, just went in and put like a gray color for the goblin. Background's going to be purple and green to give it kind of just some action lines. That's just added in for dramatic effect, those background images there. And again here, it's just to separate what's happening. You've got the horizon, the sky, that kind of thing. Color is just defining all the aspects of this for the flats. This is also where I started putting in the special effects for the fairy. And you go to tone, which is basically when you put in lighting effects, shadows, and this is just a different color on top of everything. So for the lighting effect here, I just used a bright blue and a darker blue on top of the green. And digital comics, you can do a lot of transparency stuff, or you can do layers that are transparent. They're not totally opaque on top of each other. So it's like having pieces of transparent plastic that are colored on top of each other. You get a better effect that way. This is something that's harder to do traditionally. You'd have to kind of know all this information at the same time you're doing this. Another reason digitally is a little easier to work with. You can also tweak this stuff after. Like if I hadn't done this lighting effect on the fairy yet, I could put this in now and it would still work. Everything would be fine because they're on different layers. That's another strength of digital, is being able to work in layers that are adjustable and editable. Okay, so you decided you want to make some comics digitally. What do you need as far as hardware goes? Not a whole lot, honestly. You need some kind of computer. Mac or PC, it doesn't really matter. Linux too, if you can find the software to run on it, that's fine. And some sort of input device. I recommend a drawing tablet of some kind, either the kind you can draw on and see the screen like this, Cintiq or other off-brand kind of thing. The Cintiq's, Wacom's just the biggest brand that's out there at the moment. There are lots of manufacturers that make these kind of things. It's basically just a second monitor that hooks to your computer that has pressure sensitivity on it, so you can see while you're drawing on top of it. That's the basis of it. These kind of tablets, also called drawing tablets, confusingly enough, are more like input devices like mouse or keyboard. You can't see anything on this, but what it does is translate what you make a mark on here onto the screen of whatever computer you're using. And it's pressure sensitive as well, so it's more like drawing with real paper and real pencil. You don't have to use a pressure sensitive solution to draw, of course. You can draw with a mouse if you really want to. You can draw everything on paper and scan it in for color if you want to. This is all up to you. You've seen the steps before. Those are even suggested steps. You don't have to do all that either. But the easiest, most normal feeling way for most people to draw art on the computer, any kind of art, but especially comics art, is going to be to use an input device that has pressure sensitivity. Sorry, I'm all over the place. If you want a portable solution, I recommend an iPad Pro or iPad 6. I think it's 4th generation. The first one that can use Apple Pencil, basically. Because what that gives you is the same effect as this. It's not quite as powerful as your PC or Mac desktop computer would be, but it runs well enough to run probably the software you're going to need to make your comic. I use this to make comics. I made the last comic project I worked on was a collaboration I got hired to help with, and I did the entire thing on my iPad. In the program that I'm going to show you in just a few minutes. Things to keep in mind for your computer, you will need some RAM, a sufficient amount of RAM. If you're going to use Photoshop or some of the high-end stuff, you're going to need a lot of RAM and a pretty powerful processor, a CPU. If you're using some of the other things I'm going to mention, not so much, but you won't need a gaming PC, basically. You'll need something that's fast, but RAM is more important because you're dealing with large files. I do recommend a pressure-sensitive drawing tool and a high-resolution display, the screen, and a solid-state hard drive. Those load. They don't have disks inside. They're not physical hard drives. They're more like flash drives. So it loads data and stores data really fast. It's also a little more secure because there's no moving parts inside to fail. They can fail, obviously. Imagine thumb drives do fail, but I recommend that if you have the wherewithal because it's much faster and more secure for your data. Quick note about types of digital graphics. There are two main types of digital graphics that your computer can produce, raster and vector. You guys might be familiar with this already. Raster is basically resolution dependent, which means that every part of color, every piece of color on the screen is represented by what's called a pixel. Pixels are just picture elements is what pixel means, and that's just a way of saying the computer knows that this particular piece of the screen is this color. The thing about pixel art is it's resolution dependent, which means if you take this circle that you printed out, the circle in the web would be 72 dots per inch. It's a standard web resolution. You took that and blew it up to A4 or A3, printed it out, you get a lot of anti-aliasing dots because the computer is having to figure out exactly where the edge of the object is and which pixels are which pixel. The higher the resolution, the smaller these squares are going to be, but you're always going to have them. So if this was, instead of 72 dpi, if this was like 600 dpi and you printed it out A3, or whatever size, let's say this is A3 size, and you printed out A3 size, you won't be able to see these very well. They'll be almost invisible. They are still there, though. Like if you go 1200 dpi, they get even smaller, but they're still there. Just depends on how large you print it. Also, you'll end up doing a lot of layers with this sort of thing, which adds to a lot of pixels, and that leads to a lot of processor use, which is another reason you need a fast processor, and RAM, too. Vector graphics are a little bit different. Vector graphics are the computer does mathematical computations, like geometry, to figure out, you'll be telling the computer, if you drew a circle, for instance, this is where the center is, this is where the outside edge is, this is how thick it is, and the computer will do the math to produce a circle. It's resolution independent, which means no matter how close you zoom into this, you're always going to get a smooth edge. That is very useful if you're planning on working on something that's going to be blown up large later on. You don't know for sure. The difference with this is you have trouble with certain effects, like getting colors to blend together is more difficult with vector graphics because everything has a hard edge. Obviously, that makes it more difficult. Also, you'll find yourself making lots of objects in computer terms, which means this might be one object, or it could be thousands of little objects. If you just did dots and made a circle, it might look like a circle, but you zoom in and it would be hundreds of little objects. And the more objects you have, the more calculations the computer has to do, and therefore your processor strain. It's really just a matter of what you like to work with. Feel free to check them both out. Most softwares can handle at least both of them, at least in a minor capacity. Generally speaking, things like text and panel boxes, speech balloons, anything like that will probably end up being vector, or they should be at least when you start, because those are smooth geometric shapes, and there's no reason to make them anti-alias like that if you don't need to. Okay, so what type of software do you want to use if you're going to be doing this? These will all work on Mac and PC, I believe. Some of the free things may or may not have Mac versions. I know they have PC versions because I've used them all. There's always the big heavy hitter, Photoshop. Illustrator is the vector version if you want to do that type of art. These are both available on subscription from Adobe. I forget the price right now, but it is a monthly fee you have to pay forever, basically. You don't own the software, you pay a rental fee, essentially. I like to use a software called Clip Studio Pro, or EX. It used to be called Clip Studio Paint, which is why the image looks different. This Japanese software that was developed to help make manga. It's an all-in-one comic book creating solution. You can do your thumbnails, you can do your sketches, you can do your line art, colors, text, panels, pages. You can even do, if you get the EX version, you can do story mode, which lets you put your script into it. You can see your script as you're working. You can see the whole book laid out page by page, like a InDesign program would do. Everything you need to make comics digitally is in this program. Last comic project I worked on took place entirely inside this program, from the very beginning idea to the printable PDF at the end. There are also free alternatives for this. If you want to draw raster-based and you want a free alternative, check out GIMP. It's a free software that emulates a lot of the functions of Photoshop. It's gotten very powerful in the last few years. It has a little bit of a learning curve, but if you're not familiar with any of these, that won't matter because they're all a little bit different. Most of them are based on Photoshop as far as the controls go, but GIMP has a few things that are a little different. And then Inkscape is free vector-based drawing software that is quite good. It's pretty powerful as well. It's a little harder to learn, obviously, and a little more limited than the Illustrator, but it's also free. These are both ownable free softwares. Clip Studio, speaking of money-wise, this one probably costs about, I think it's just under $100. Might be over $100 for us in Australia, but I think it's just under $100 US. And sometimes they have sales where it's like 50-60% off. So you can get really great deals on this. And you don't need the EX to start with. If you just want to start making comics, you can get the base version and just be just fine. That's what I use. It's also available on iPad. The full version of the software works on iPad. So that is a subscription mode. I do feel like I need to mention that. If you get the app on iPad, that's a subscription you have to pay for. The thing you can use any software you can find that you like. Basically, what you need to make sure the software can do is, can it do lines and geometric shapes? You can do panels. Can it do text if you need text and if you're doing your lettering digitally? Does it handle color? And will it let me import and export files? Like, can I import sketches as JPEGs or whatever? And can I export PDFs so that I can print? And all these will do that. Most of the drawing software out there can handle that. Some may be better than some stuff than others. The text tool in Clip Studio is not the best. It's not as good as Illustrator, which is a vector-based. Half of it is text, basically. It's what you see when people do label designs, say for a bottle of wine or something. They probably used Illustrator. But yeah, just make sure your software can handle these things, and you're good. You can get good at it, or you enjoy it, or you can afford it, and it'll run on your system, and that's all you really need. So thanks everybody for hanging out and watching. Hopefully this was helpful. If you came to the presentation, thank you again for coming, and hopefully this had the answers you missed, if you missed anything, or had the refreshing information you needed. Again, feel free to contact me at seaboltillustration.com if necessary. I'd be happy to talk comics with anybody. And thank you for watching.